Welcome back to part two, social inequality. What am I going to say about this? I don't know. I have no idea. I'm not ready for this. Hey, you guys, welcome back for another chapter of sociology. Okay, here we are. Part two, social inequality. So, in the last video, we kind of set up the scene for why social inequality exists, what it is, and what causes it, and went through systems of oppression and basically talking about a lack of level playing field, which is exactly what social inequality is. Today, we're going to break down all of the ways that social inequality manifests itself through different institutions we have. So, I have some good news. I think you're going to love this. There's a section in the book that talks about the different theoretical perspectives and their view of social inequality. We're not going to worry about those. We're going to go past those and we're going to head directly into talking about socioeconomic status, why that can be a useful idea and why it also is limited. And then we're going to talk about how we see social inequality manifesting itself in different institutions, including education, family, health, income, and work. And we'll finish up by talking about and being very specific about poverty and what researchers call the culture of poverty. And given that we are in this moment in time where we're watching social disparities literally unfold on TV, I can't believe the amount of conversations going on right now about why the COVID-19 crisis is disproportionately affecting people of color. I was just 5 minutes ago watching a show that had Stacey Abrams, who was the gubernatorial candidate in Georgia in 2016, 18, fairly recently. She was talking about this very thing, why we are seeing communities of color being hit so hard by COVID. And the reason is because it's shining a light on all of the social inequalities and disparities that systemically exist. So instead of spending a huge amount of time treading around some of the stuff that the book talks about, let's seize the moment and use the COVID story unfolding right now to examine some of this. So that's where we're headed. Enjoy the lack of analytical paradigm discussion that we always have. So Weber, Marx, Durkheim, we'll have to catch you guys another time. Before we go anywhere into talking about how structural inequality manifests itself, I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of socioeconomic status, which the book presents at length. One of the things that I think is difficult about this concept, but we have to discuss it no matter what, is that I sometimes question how useful it actually is to us in understanding life. It's actually, I think, more useful as a category system that we use to kind of help break down large data about how income, wealth, power, prestige, all is correlated together. So it's helpful to consistently see different categories of income when we start to look at other effects of social life or other experiences of social life. What bothers me about it a little bit is the fact that it can be used in a determined kind of way. So it can be used to basically assume that people who fall into certain classes based on their income, which is a system that we make up in order to understand behavior, that same thing can be then used to suggest that those classes are real and they will determine behavior. I might have just made that more complicated than it needed to be. But what I'm trying to say is, if we as students and people learning about sociology use social class or socioeconomic status, which is defined in the book, as a useful tool to help understand certain categories of behavior, that's great. If we start to assume that people will act in certain ways based on those categories, that's where we get into trouble. So I want to discuss these, but I'm not going to discuss them at huge length because I don't want to put undue emphasis on them. They're kind of interesting when we start to break down data, but that is us putting on a frame of understanding after behavior has already happened, as opposed to assuming that people who may fall into the lowest class in our socioeconomic world will behave because they are in that category. Make sense? Okay, great. All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so our book identifies 6 categories. These are the 6 categories that everybody employs the same when we look at big sets of data around wealth. So we, interestingly enough, I think, we spend a lot of time and are very aware of the upper classes, the upper class, because those are the people that we see in media most often. And so there's an interesting kind of awareness that there's an upper class, and at least if you're me, you know you're not part of it. And you know you're not part of it because you don't have the trappings of it. So the upper class is obviously those who make a lot of money every year and who are able to afford a lifestyle because of that income that they have. The book, I think, interestingly, and I have it like right here off camera, the book gives occupation and degree next to the classes. I think this is really interesting because it assumes that class is determined by job and education. We know that a lot of the biggest earners in the world, that's not true for them. So I do think it's interesting that there's definitely kind of a work theme that the book presents. It makes sense. That's largely the experience of the lower classes in that system, but for the upper class, it just doesn't work for me. So the book does mention that the typical household income for the upper class is $2 million, and that is often achieved through jobs, and they list investors, heirs, executives, media, sports personalities. And for education, they list some prestigious university degrees. Okay, interesting. We can buy that. I think the more useful categories for every day, when we break down big data sets around income, it's the middle chunks of that system that are often the most used. So upper middle, middle, and lower middle. There is a ton of focus on those because at one time, this is a revised scale. At one time, there were 3 classes that were usually noted in a discussion of socioeconomic status: upper, middle, and lower. It wasn't until, I think, the 1980s. Let me go back and do my research on that exactly, but I think that is when we started to see a huge emergence of breaking down, trying to understand the difference between the upper mid and the lower mid and everything in between, because it was evident that that was a huge range of incomes that represented, and there's no way that one category could speak for everybody, running from what the book says is $40,000 a year to $150,000 a year. That used to all be lumped into one category. So they actually started splitting that farther and farther apart. And even now, I think there are models when we talk about wealth that have many, many more kind of micro designations. Because obviously, life when you're earning $40,000 is going to look vastly different than life when you're earning $150,000 a year. Totally different, right? So anyway, the middle class, those middle classes are kind of listed that way. That I would say, just percentage-wise, we're looking at that representing almost 75% of the American economy. So obviously, there's good reason to unpack that. And that runs from at the upper, everybody who's in that mid-executive range of kind of corporate work. I think there are some now creative professions and kind of digital or engineering professions that even entry level could enter in there. Certainly, financial industry would kind of fall into largely upper middle, probably. Middle class, they mention as semi-professionals, which I think is interesting. I don't know what semi-professionals are, but you can see by education that there's an overlap in all of these. And then the working class, or the lower middle class, my snack just fell down, are the people who are hovering right around where the government starts to identify what the federal poverty limit is. So if you're working class or below, your income is going to start falling into that government category of potentially living under the standard income that it would take to live comfortably in the United States. And we'll talk more about the federal poverty limit, what that means, and how they calculate it a little bit later in this video. So the book takes these sections and breaks down kind of some ideas about the behavior, about maybe spending patterns, how people live, what their typical type of lifestyle is in those categories. I think the important thing for me, you can read those. I'm sure you've had to deal with some inquisitive questions about those. For me, it is not important to know the characteristics of these different classes. What's important to recognize here is the bigger idea. In the last video, we talked about two particular types of systems of oppression, and the second one was a caste system. When you look at economic life in the U.S. through these categorical labels, right, these categories of people, you can start to see that there is a caste system here. It's not technically legally enforced necessarily, but it's the way that our lives are structured. And if those income levels really affect the way that we behave, then we can start to see that there's a hierarchy that exists. We know, if you look at, I think in the last video I said that in a caste system, the power, wealth, and privilege all go from low to high. So the higher you go up on the stratified scale, the more you get of those things. I think there's an argument to be made here, obviously, about that being true regarding wealth in the United States. It's hard to argue that you can have full access to the goals and dreams of American society and be in what the book is calling the underclass, which to me sounds very rude. But they are the lowest earners. They are in the deepest depths of poverty. How are they supposed to access the goals and dreams of the U.S., making not even enough to survive? They're basically living the existence of someone who in another country might be living in a developing country, and yet they're living in the United States in the same land as someone who makes so much money that you can't even physically spend it in a year. So this is how inequality starts to really come to fruition in the United States. When you have that amount of stratification in a system that we're going to talk and explore more about how the system plays out, but plays out this inequality in different facets of life, there you go. You have inequality baked in to any given place you're living in, depending on what the standard is for determining what wealth, power, and privilege means. In other countries, it might be other things. It really depends on what that driving resource is that people value most. So in some places, it's not wealth, it's not money or physical resources necessarily, financial resources. It might be the color of skin that determines how valuable a person may be seen in a society. In other places, it might be a religious denomination or classification. In some places, it might be a gender that determines who has wealth, power, and privilege and who doesn't. So it can vary based on what the society determines is important. But once that's determined, whoever has the most of what's important is going to be relatively high. And whoever is lacking that is going to be relatively low on the scale. And so there you have your inequality. Now, and the book does point this out, and I said this before too, but when we do talk about socioeconomic status, it's a flawed system in a lot of ways, because whenever you make a scale of anything, we start to think of things in really discrete categories, right? We know that social mobility in the United States is hard. It's not as hard as it is in some places. In some places, it's impossible. You can't be socially mobile, meaning you likely absolutely cannot go up. And in some places, it might be hard to go down depending on how their caste system works. So, although generally speaking, when it comes to stratification, it's always easier to go down. It's very hard to go up. And that, I think, is a truly lived experience in every kind of way, if you're me. But what was I saying? Oh, yeah. The categories are flawed because, first of all, this is not as discreetly drawn as reality is. We know that there's not a uniform for people in different categories. We also know that these different traits don't universally apply to everybody in a certain category. So we always have to be careful talking about socioeconomic status because there's a lot of variability in these categories. You can always list people by their income. What is harder to establish is how that income is playing out in life choices. I also think there's something to be said for wealth and perceived wealth. And let me tell you what I'm thinking about. Today, we live in a time in which credit is at an unprecedented high. So I'm talking about credit cards or loans, borrowing money. This is a really interesting kind of wrench thrown into socioeconomic status because the fact is that we all, to a certain degree, have the ability, if we have credit, if we have the ability to borrow money, you can actually end up living a life that looks like that of a higher class than you actually are based on how much money you have. So there's this kind of interplay, and the book actually, very importantly, talks about intersectionality. A huge concept, intersectionality. Finally, and we've talked about this before, but the book finally talks about this in a way that makes sense to me, saying and reminding us that one trait often does not determine anything. It's the multiplying of the way different traits work together to understand how life is affected for people. So that is to say, you can't consider income without considering gender and race at the same time. Those three traits, at the very least, have to be taken together, because there is no such thing as a standard experience of women. We know the experiences of women vary a lot based on race and based on income. And so you begin to take these characteristics and apply them to these different categories, and you end up getting a lot more categories of experience. That's what intersectionality is, essentially, is taking into consideration multiple characteristics about a person at one time while trying to understand their behavior or how their social experience is. So all of those things are kind of important, but they throw a little bit of a wrench into using socioeconomic status as a useful category. I think that makes sense. If that does not make sense, if you want me to talk more about that, write it in the comment below. All right, let's get to talking about some of the ways that we see inequality working itself out in different aspects of life as we know them today. I'll be honest with you, the next section of the book makes me a little annoyed. Every section that it lays out from, I have it right here. Every section that it lays out, starting with the family, going through health, education, work, income, and criminal justice, lists, and you could and should read what it talks about in terms of people who are less likely to X because they are. So for instance, in the family, one of the statements that it says is that people who are higher educated are less likely to get divorced. When I read statements like that, it makes it seem as though one of those things is causing the other. Because they are higher educated, they are less likely to be divorced. This is a clear perspective that the book is giving us. It's a lens that we are using to interpret that data, and we can turn it on its head and ask some other questions as well. I'm not going to go through this section of the book. Is actually, the data in it is really good. I think what you should do is read these sections, look at the charts and the graphs that they give, and decide whether or not you have issues with some of the statements that they make in there. Does it make sense? Does it sound biased in any way? To me, it does a little bit. The perspective of this textbook is coming out in the way they interpret data. So instead of going piece by piece through this data that's presented in the textbook, what I would like to do is present some data from the Census and the Pew Research Center, both of which are very respected, legitimate sources of data, to show how and what kind of data we have on income, earnings, and poverty, and show how disaggregating that data begins to give us a very different picture of what the story is regarding poverty and inequality in this country. So at this point, if you are following along in the chapter, you will note that I'm going to not be covering this next section. What is likely going to happen is that we're going to switch to, or we're going to like jump to poverty. My data is different, but it's certainly telling a similar story here. And that middle section of talking about the family, the other institutions, you can read through, and you should do a critique for yourself of the perspective. Okay guys, the first thing I wanted to show you was some actual data to establish, in case you still weren't sure whether inequality exists. This establishes that it in fact does. You can see that this graph is cut almost in half from top to bottom, with the teal part taking up about the top 1/2. You'll notice that that represents the highest 20% in any economy. The rest of the entire economy is under the half line. So right away, we already see that inequality exists in its most basic form. We have top 20% of earners taking up more than half of that graph, which is inequality at its finest. This next visualization is so interesting to me. There's a lot to take in here, so let's take just a second to unpack what we're looking at. This is an actual visualization done by the analysts at the US Census. It's something that you don't typically see very much. It's the next level up from a basic bar graph or pie chart. What you're looking at here, it kind of speaks to the data around the section in the book that I was ranting about earlier, about families and how poverty or inequality shows up in families. Now, this is data about the 2018 poverty rate. So what we're looking at here on the left side with those horizontal bars with the little dots on them, we see that's the actual data values as they appear. You see where it says the 2018 poverty rate. Immediately to the right of that, it says change 2017 to 2018. That's a percent change. So you actually have two pieces of data being represented in the same visualization, which is interesting. So what is the data we're looking at here? Okay, we're looking at families of different types and what percentage of them are at the 2018 poverty rate. So the standout story here is, if you look in this first section called primary families, you see here married couple families, 4.7% of them are living at the poverty rate or below. Female householder, no spouse, so that's a female-headed household, unmarried, 24.9%, 25%. That means 1 in 4 female-led households are living in poverty. And the male householder is about half of that, 12.7%. So we can see right away the big takeaway story here is that single mom families are way more at risk for being in poverty than any other groups. That's how you read this chart, and you'll see that every kind of related area will have a all line, which is first line, all primary families, and then it'll break those down. This is an example of what's called disaggregated data. So it's taking these particular circumstances and it's delineating the difference between different types of families. If we go down kind of to the middle of the area, you see the breakdown for in families with a female householder, no spouse. I want you to look at the last line there. So we already looked at the 26.8%. There can be different values because of rounding and stuff. So in families with a female householder, no spouse, 26.8% are likely to live in poverty. If there are related children under 18, that jumps up to 40%. That's 4 in 10. And even scarier, if there are related children under age 6, 47.7%. Almost 50% of single family or female-headed household families with young kids are living in poverty. That is a terrifying number. You can also look down. The last one is people not in families. All that means, and the way the Census Bureau defines family, is a unit of people living in the same house who are related by blood. So unrelated individuals, generally we're talking about single people living on their own. And I did have to look it up. Unrelated subfamilies, you'll see in here, that refers to married couples who do not have children, or people living in the house who are not related by blood. So that's the way the census defines this category. Like it or not, that's the way they define it. That often is part of the problem in figuring out what their data is telling us, because they don't define it in a way that may be typical for a lot of us. Here's another classic example of disaggregated income data. So here you start to see the difference in trends between white and black income over time. And not surprisingly, what a lot of our data we've already discussed has said is that the white income outpaced black income by quite a lot, and we can see in this graph, because it's set over a time frame, that this is a trend over time. It's persistent is what we would call it. So it continues to rise for whites, it continues to rise for blacks, but the gap in between is often what we refer to when we're talking about a gap, opportunity gap, equality gap, anything, income equality gap. That gap exists. You can see it's almost exactly parallel, those two lines, except they are running at a pretty regular interval there going up, so that the black line is never going to really, it doesn't look like it's going to intersect the white line anytime soon. And that is proof to us that income equality, when we take race into consideration, is a real thing. And here we have the full picture of income by race, including other races and ethnicities. You'll see here a couple things I didn't mention in the last one, although it's the same for the last one as well. These are median household incomes, which means we take the median we discussed is basically you lay out a range of numbers, and the number that is right smack in the middle is your median. We use that as a good measure of central kind of placement, as opposed to average, which can be really affected by high amounts on either end of the scale. Median is a much more kind of conservative measure of being in the middle. What we have here is, you can see Asians in this country have traditionally outpaced any other race in income, with white, not Hispanic, following. Your average of all of your races is right in the middle, so you can see white and Asians are outpacing the average median income in the US. Hispanic of any race comes next, and Black is that green line at the bottom. So what's the main story that we're seeing here? We see that number one, there is clearly data that supports the idea that income and race is correlated. One may not cause the other, but there's definitely the experience on a broad scale that if you are Hispanic of any race, meaning you identify as white or Black or other, and Blacks in this country tend to make less money and they make under the median income in the US, while whites and Asians make higher amounts regularly. And you can see also, look at these trends persisting over time. You really don't have much intersection of these numbers anywhere. One little word about the little break you see at the end. Whenever you have a broken line, it doesn't mean there was a mistake in formatting or something. What that means is that the census actually started asking questions differently in the year. So all they did was they restarted their lines and they broke them to show that they were now asking a slightly different question than they had in the past. So right here, in case we had any doubt that income was unequally distributed or able to be gotten, this should be the graph that proves that race does correlate to different income levels, and that the communities of color, the minority races in this country right now, tend to get the lower end of the stick. The questions that we have to ask ourselves when looking at this type of graph is really, what do we attribute to this? Why would Asians in this country be making such high incomes as opposed to our communities of color? We then start to unpack the lived reality. So we ask about what kind of jobs are they more likely to have? What type of living experience are they more likely to have? Do they rent their houses? Do they buy their houses? Do they have a lot of possessions? Do they tend to live more minimalist lifestyles? Things like that start to come into the equation. And none of that is actually true. These are just examples that I was throwing out there to illustrate. I just read something the other day, like yesterday, that said that in data that we have had about Asian Americans up to this point, we have had kind of that model minority mindset about them, because a lot of Asians who have migrated to this country come here as professionals to be professionals here as well. And so their incomes are skewed a little higher, but they also, for the first time ever this year, are the category with the most income variability across all of their classes. So what researchers are thinking is happening is that as time goes on, more Asian immigrants from a variety of backgrounds with a variety of reasons for coming here are immigrating to the US, and we'll start to see a much more varied picture of what the Asian American experience is. They're not just being drawn by professional opportunities here. Those questions we have to ask ourselves when it comes to all of the racial categories. So the question is, why do Blacks and Hispanics struggle with income? The answer is everything we have talked about up to this point. Remember when we talked about inequality, the systems of oppression, the structural disadvantages, all of those factors lead into this data. And this data then supports us going back and turning around on that and examining that even further to see if we can really understand the really fine details of why that may be happening. Isn't it funny when you look at different data how strikingly different it makes it seem? This is exactly, it's saying basically the exact same thing that the last graph was saying, except it's the reverse. So this is the percentage of uh, population by race or ethnicity that live in poverty. The one thing well, a couple things I really like about this. First of all, it's very clear and it tells the same story that our income graph did, but it does include Native Americans as an ethnic group, and that's incredibly important. From a structural standpoint, they are per capita facing the worst income disparity, but the number of them, which is low relative population, makes it hard to often consider them side by side with these other racial categories that are so huge. I'm glad they are here. The other reason that I like this is because it shows you the actual threshold, the poverty table that the government puts out. So this, just for a moment here, when we talk about the federal poverty level, what that is a standard that is put out every year by the federal government to basically determine who is eligible for public benefits. This table here shows you how they determine whether or not you are living in poverty. And what they do is they don't only take into account the income in a household, they also take into account the number of people living there. So the income amount that determines whether or not you are eligible for public benefits has to be matched with the number of people living in the household. And this table shows you for 2017 what those numbers are, so you can get a sense of that. And every year they publish a new table, and those numbers change to adjust for inflation and some of the other financial kind of adjustments that they have to make in order to determine that. Disaggregating data is not just something that we do using race as the category. In this upcoming piece of data, you see that we can disaggregate by sex and gender. So the people in poverty can be determined by women, men, and I couldn't find a graphic for this, but they have actually started, and I think it's very smart, to also disaggregate income and poverty numbers based on cisgender versus non-cisgender and sexual orientation. All of those things, any of these categories that we use to examine things like poverty, who tends to find themselves more in living in poverty or not being able to make enough income to rise above that threshold. All of those categories are chosen because they show themselves to be important in that picture. So starting to unpack those reasons that may be happening is really important to understanding this phenomenon that is obviously very difficult and is something we want to work against. When we change our category from sex to age, we get kind of a scary picture of poverty. 16.2% of children, that's 18 and under, live in poverty. I think the stat here says 1 in 6. And seniors in poverty, so if we look at our aging population, we can see that there is a large percentage of our senior population who live in poverty. This is particularly interesting, especially considering public benefits, because we know that the seniors are the largest group to receive public benefits via Social Security. So knowing that that many seniors live in poverty not only gives us a sense of what their life is like, but it also helps us make policy decisions that we hope will cover them. I think sometimes it depends on the administration, but sometimes this number is a little bit forgotten. So if we disaggregate by age, this kind of changes the picture of what we're looking at in terms of who is living in poverty. All right, this is the second to last one, guys. Hang in there with me. This I think is so cool. It's actually not a piece of data that we're going to use, but what this is it's a list of all of the characteristics that we typically can and should disaggregate data by. So you're really just looking at what this actually is a program evaluation that the UN did of all of its programs, which are the boxes below, and the different types of ways that they disaggregate the data from those programs. That's what this grid is up at the top. It's not so important to me that you know what you're looking at here, except these categories that are listed under indicators. All of these categories that follow are ways that we should be slicing our data in order to pay attention to the differences, and not just the differences one in and of themselves, but how all of those play together. Earlier in this chapter, we talked about intersectionality, and this is the greatest example of how intersectionality can be really complicated, because what I've shown you here today is just a different slicing of the data by these large categories of race, gender, class, age. Intersectionality says we really get to real data when we start looking at these things together. So instead of just looking at a distribution of income by race, what our distribution should show is income by race and gender and age together. That will automatically add 3 lines to every 1 line that is on the graph now. But the reason we need to do that is to understand that not all women have the same experience based on what race they are. Not all races have the same experience depending on what age they are, and so on and so on. These factors can be mixed together to better understand specific lived realities, and then really begin to see who is suffering from structural disadvantages, which is the whole point of disaggregating data in the first place. Data will tell us big data especially, will tell us a great story about, on average, what's happening. But the problem is that especially for groups that are systemically disenfranchised, average is not a good measurement for them. Their experience is not average, it's not typical. And so the more we can get specific about who they are and what circumstances they are facing, the better our data can inform us about what to do to make sure that they can be re-enfranchised. Enfranchised? I don't know what the word is, but they don't have to be disenfranchised anymore. And finally, our last one, I just wanted to show you how interesting data can be when you add the very last category or trait that we often forget exists as a real thing. But location can play a huge role in helping us understand this phenomenon, but also in contributing to this phenomenon. So this is a map of the income data that we've already looked at that has been put onto the geographical location in the US. And what it's telling us here is that the highest declines in the poverty rate are in the South. Why do we think that may be the case? I want you to write your supposition, why that may be the case. write it in the comments box below. I think this tells us everything about the entire chapter that we've undertaken here so far. So make sure to give your thoughts, and I'll lend you my thoughts at a later time. That's all the data we have for right now. Okay, guys. This is where I'm going to call it for this discussion of social inequality. If anything, my hope is that you will leave, number one, believing that social inequality is a thing. Number two, believing it's a thing not because it's your opinion, but because data proves that it's a thing. And number three, starting to think about how this will color the stuff that we are going to talk about in the future. Financial status, wealth, power, privilege, all of those things really play an enormous role in this country. Material needs are always the first needs that we need to take care of. So understanding how this playing field shakes out and realizing that what we have in life is not as much as we want to believe it's based on merit and working hard and the American dream. There are only some of us who have full access to believing that's the case and having experience play that out. For a majority of us, as this data shows, the playing field is not even set. And sometimes the challenges of it are overwhelming to think about overcoming. But it doesn't mean that it can't be done. It just means that we need to pay attention to the difference between a trouble and an issue. When is it an individual thing that we have control over and that we can kind of take the bull by the horns about? And when is it something that is creating or presenting to us a structural barrier that collectively we need to work together to figure out how to remove? So I think that's where I want to leave it for now. Make sure to do your inquisitive. At the end of when this video is up, you should go to D2L, answer some questions there. Any comments on this video will be considered extra effort by you. I do hope that we start to use that comments box because it helps me understand where you are with the material, with the class, with whatever, and we'll try to address it the best we can. And I'll see you in the next video for the next exciting chapter of sociology.